This is the Cycling Over 60 podcast, Season 3, Episode 39, Data Science and Your Health. And I'm your host, Tom Butler. I'm not going to do an extensive update for this episode because my interview this week was such a great conversation and it went on a little longer than normal. Here are a few things that I want to share. First, I want to continue to invite people to join the Cycling Over 60 Tour de Cure team. I love the idea of using the Tour de Cure as a launch party for the summer cycling season. The ride in the Seattle area takes place on May 2nd, and there are several Tour de Cure events across the nation. I know it seems like a long way off, but I'm looking to do some fun things that will take time to develop. So I'm trying to get people signed up really early. The American Diabetes Association organization that I'm working with is in the Pacific Northwest, and the ride is in the Seattle area. I would love it if some of you from out of the area would come visit here and ride with us. One of the reasons that I'm promoting it so early is to give people time to plan a trip here. The route is around Lake Washington, and I believe it's worth a trip here to do that ride. You can find a link to the team in the show notes or go to tour.diabetes.org/teams/CO60. Or you can just go to the Tour de Cure Pacific Northwest and search for Cycling Over 60. If you'd like to know more about our plans, email us at info.cyclingover60.org. I took the opportunity to participate in a fun event a couple of weeks ago. If you pay attention to the Cycling Over 60 Instagram, you saw a picture of me doing my first cyclocross race. I've talked about doing cyclocross in the past, but my participation in this event happened in a very different way than I thought it would. I originally planned to start training for a race this fall. I didn't know if I would actually do a race. I was going to see how the training went. But only a couple days before the race, Garen called me and encouraged me to try it out. The race was put on by an organization called Lemon Peel, and this was in Steilacoom, Washington. And a big factor for me riding it was that the course was designed to be very friendly for new riders. We did a few practice laps before the race, and that made me feel pretty confident that I could finish. I really had no idea when I started the race if I would do well or not. Within seconds of the start signal, I knew that I wasn't going to be keeping up with others. My limiting factor is my heart rate. I believe I need to keep from going above 160 beats per minute very often. For the race, my average heart rate was 162 beats per minute, so I was staying right at my max. But I just couldn't generate enough power to keep up with everyone. In fact, I was lapped by the entire group. Interestingly, as I was loading up my bike, some people I knew came by and told me that the race organizers were looking for me. I checked in with the organizers and found out that I had won. It turned out that I was the only Category 4 rider in the over 60 subcategory. So I ended up with a very fun Lemon Peel winner medal. I guess you could call it a medal. It was actually made out of wood. But if you go over to the Cycling Over 60 Instagram, you can find a picture of it. I enjoyed myself too much. I really want to have a Cycling Over 60 cyclocross team next fall. The truth of the matter is, I am pretty sure I'm going to be one of the last finishers in any race that I do. But I still found it to be a really fun event in a specific way. There is something about being in a race that I really enjoy. Now, here's the problem. If I'm going to ride cyclocross, I do need to have a cyclocross bike. The bike I used for this event was my Trek FX3, and it really wasn't the best thing. I certainly will keep everyone posted on my search for a new bike. The final thing that I want to mention is a new free program being offered by Road Scholar. Starting Thursday, October 23rd, there is a 5-lecture series that, in their words, offers open, honest conversations about aging. Candid, uplifting, and grounded in wisdom rather than worry, these online gatherings are designed for those navigating life's fourth age, a stage not defined by limitation, but by perspective and resilience. I truly like Road Scholar and the events that they do, even though I've never participated. But I will be checking out these lectures. I'm expecting great things from these 5 lectures. And again, they're free and I believe really worth checking out. I always enjoy hearing from listeners who share their journey with me through email. A while ago, I got a message from Rob MacLeod. Rob is an avid cyclist who has been heavily involved in the cycling community in Salt Lake City. If you search for Professor Rob's Bike Page, Utah, you will find some of his writings on cycling. I'll post a link in the show notes. There is a lot of interesting stuff there, but I really wanted to have Rob talk about his professional work. He has been on the leading edge of technology and health for a long time. I was really excited to get his perspective, and here is our conversation. I am really pleased to welcome Dr. Rob MacLeod to the podcast today. Thank you, Dr. MacLeod, for joining me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a big follower of your podcast, and it's a real honor to be part of it.
I'm thrilled because you bring a real combination, your academic work, your cycling, everything. There's a real combination of perspectives that you bring, and I'm thrilled to be having this conversation. And I'm going to let you talk about your background, your professional background and everything in a bit. But I want to start out by asking you to share your earliest memory of the bicycle.
Yeah, this is interesting. I thought back a little bit about this, and it was sort of a twofold experience, which has influenced me in both ways. So I remember as probably a 6 or 7 year old, getting my first bike and learning how to ride it, and all the usual experiences of crashing and getting better and gaining the independence that a bicycle brings. And that's continues to be a wonderful part of my life for sure. The other aspect that also left an indelible impression, and I guess shaped a lot of my relationship with the bike, was that this is one of the first times that my father and I, or that I can remember my father and I working on something mechanical together. And so I remember him at some point, taking the axle out of the bike, or I think it was a little more than changing a flat tire. It was actually doing some servicing on the bike, and for me to get some idea of what the internals of a bicycle looked like. And that set a seed that, continues to this day. And I don't think I've ever had a time in my adult life when I didn't have some form of a bicycle service space in wherever I was living. Even as a student, I had a closet in my living room, and I had all the bike tools in there, and I'd roll out a plastic sheet in my living room floor, and I'd set up a stand and pull the tools out and work on my bicycle even then. And ever since then, it's this mechanical aspect has always fascinated me. I guess as an engineer, I live in a house that I had the good fortune to design. And so the bike shop was built into the house right from the start. And it has, more or less it's never big enough. You always underestimate how much space you need ultimately. But I have this designated space, and it is one of my truly happy spaces to inhabit. And the neighborhood kids sometimes bring their bikes over when they need a little service. And so there's that part of it. And as I say, both the sense of a cyclist and the sense of appreciating the mechanical aspects of a bicycle really went back to those earliest days of my memory of first exposure to a bike. And I also, not too long after that, it was a few years after I started riding, I had another indelible experience, which I think most of us have had at some point, and that is of having your bicycle stolen. So I, made the beginner mistake. I leaned it up against a window of some kind of store I was going into. I ran into the store. When I came out, the bike was gone. And so that is also probably was the beginning of thinking about bicycle advocacy and trying to figure out a comprehensive way to think about how bicycles should fit into our lives, and the diverse aspects of support that are needed to make cycling a viable, safe, functional means of both transportation and recreation and even performance sport.
Did you keep up with cycling throughout your life?
Yeah, there was a gap after the first bike got stolen. And it took a little while to get another one. And then I kind of went through early teenage years, not riding so much, and had the enormous good fortune. It was another life-changing aspect of my life. My father was a professor as well, and he had a sabbatical, which is a wonderful element of university life that I'm not very good at taking advantage of in my own professional career. But the idea is fantastic that you get to go to another lab, another setting, another environment, and learn new techniques and broaden your network of scientific connections. And it's an incredibly healthy part of academia. So he had one of these sabbaticals, and by then we were 4 children. I'm the oldest of 4 siblings. And he decided that it was time for us all to go to another country, learn another language, and be exposed to a whole different culture. And he was able to merge that goal with his academic goals. And so we ended up in southern Germany in a beautiful city called Freiburg. And so, of course, there bicycle culture is everywhere. And all of my friends at school, I was, more or less thrown into a German school and told to figure it out. And so while I was learning the language as quickly as I could and making friends, I realized if I'm going to hang out with these guys, I at least need a bike, if not eventually a moped or something motorized, but at least I need a bicycle to get to and from school. That was my, first purchase of this is the early 70s, what we called generically the 10-speed, right? So the first kind of racing style of bicycle. And I remember finding one of these somewhere used and bringing it home, and my father, again, helping me with it and getting it set up to take to school. And this is also where I again, learned an important mechanical lesson because my father had never seen a derailleur before. He was good with his hands and, he was more a carpenter than a mechanic, but was, willing to figure this out. So we put the bike together, we got it going, everything was fine. And I was riding it to school very proudly for the first day. And it was a little hill I had to get up to get to the school, and I went to put the bike in the smallest gear. And I don't know if you ever experienced this, but the derailleur immediately went into the spokes, ended up wrapped around the axle, and was snapped in half, literally. It was one of these old plastic, Irrit was the name of the company that used to make these plastic body derailleurs, were a thing at the time. And it just snapped the derailleur in half. So rather than riding proudly into the school that day, I was, dragging my bike, onto the school, feeling very despondent, discouraged. So again, that led to a whole new set of lessons, both in bike mechanics and also of the relationships that one can forge through this common interest in bicycles. It came about because one of my classmates, he heard my story, saw my bike, and spontaneously said, "Oh, yeah, I come over to my place. We can figure this out." And so through some combination of time with him and then, getting a new derailleur, he actually taught me, how to set up a derailleur properly, how to get it on the bike so that it shifted but didn't run off the rails. And so again, deepening the mechanical, aspects of bicycling, and also this relationships and the notion of the importance of relationships that are formed through common interest. He and I were very different in terms of our background and upbringing. He was German. That was a small difference in the end, but came from a wonderfully modest background and lived in an apartment and like most German sort of middle class people do. And so it was an amazing opportunity to also learn about German culture, what it's like in a typical German family, and we ended up spending a lot of time together. And then we started doing a few adventures where we would go off on rides into the foothills and into the higher mountains, sometimes of the Black Forest. That was my first exposure going up Nova Scotia. It's not a terribly mountainous place, but it was the first exposure, to mountains, to serious cycling culture, and from then on, I was pretty much addicted. So I cycled a lot during that year. It was a bit of a hiatus when I came back. I cycled some, but again, it wasn't as conducive, in this part of Canada where I was living at the time. But then the big move came when I, was in my undergraduate years. I was spending them mostly in Germany, the summers at least. And then after my undergraduate degree, I ended up moving to Austria. I lived there for about 7 years. And that was where, things really took off. Don't tell anybody, but I used my student loan to buy a nice bicycle. And and because I was going to university there as well. And so I was going to university and working and riding my bike and of course, living in a place like Austria, it's incredibly conducive to bicycling as commuting, but also bicycle as adventure opportunity, bicycle touring and riding in the mountains. And I've certainly never let up.
You talk about
these experiences, including the bicycle being stolen, and then kind of, looking at the whole, how do we make the environment more conducive to a bicycle? And then being exposed to a different culture, do you feel like you're atypical as far as your view of transportation? Because we're so car centric in the US, and it seems like you had some experiences that kind of opened you up to not being so car centric. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's we just recently met some new neighbors who grew up in New York and spent the last 25 years in New York City, and they sort of described their urban life, and they did some bicycling. But I learned, over time that it doesn't have to be short commutes and dense cities that are conducive to a non-motorized form of transportation. Even in Austria, I lived outside of the city, so I had a fairly long commute by bike. And when I first got there, I thought, oh, well, this is way too far. I'll never be able to do this on my bicycle. And so for a little while, I had a motorcycle. This is, what you do when you're in your 20s. I had my motorcycle, managed not to have an accident with it, but then found myself when the weather was okay and I felt like I had the time. I thought, well, why don't I ride my bike? Let's just see how this goes. And so I tried it. And then little by little, the motorcycle was gathering dust and the bicycle was getting more use. And so I thought, okay, let's sell the motorcycle before, there's nothing worse or more dangerous, I think, than a motorcyclist who doesn't ride regularly. It's a skill you have to develop, cultivate, and maintain. So I thought, okay, I'm not using it. Let's get rid of it. And then by then I was getting into riding, many days a week, not every day, weather permitting. And this at that time was probably, I don't know, maybe a 10-kilometer one-way commute with some climbing. I lived in a village above the city, so I was climbing every day. And that really set the tone for, what it's possible to do and started me down the path that I'm very much on now. I have a daily commute that's about 15 kilometers each way. I climb 300 meters or 1,000 feet to get back to my home every day. And I ride throughout the year, even here in Utah, where we have some, sometimes some pretty serious winter weather. So it sort of expanded what's possible. But at that time, just as a practical possibility, I don't think I really analyzed it as much as I have in later years. And now it's become such an important part of both my physical health and mental well-being. And it's just a part of my routine that I deeply miss when I actually have to take the car for some practical reason. The weather really does prohibit it. So I think that, that's been a process that took time to develop. And just along with the mindset that, we all hear about, but sometimes it's hard to put into practice, that there's no such thing as bad weather. There's just bad clothing. And so it took a while for me to turn that into a practice and, and develop the techniques and clothing and whatever other bits and pieces accumulated that make riding all year round a real possibility.
I love the fact that you have this mindset that I think is definitely a bicycling mindset. And that comes in a lot of different forms. Today, I want to talk about your view of technology when it comes to healthcare. You have been involved in so many interesting things. I'm not going to try to encapsulate it, but how do you talk about your professional background? How do you explain who you are as a professional to people?
Sure, that is an interesting question. I give a number of presentations to students here at the University of Utah, some of them about career and the pathway to a career. And I emphasize that many interesting careers are what I would call nonlinear, or certainly not predictable. And mine was like that. So going to Austria for all that time was certainly not part of a typical academic career. I went there for a couple of years to do a master's degree, and 7 years later, I came back with my master's degree. I did manage to get that, but a whole lot of life experience and professional scientific experience that certainly shaped the future. But along the way, and the master's degree I got ended up not being in what I do now, but actually in audio and sound engineering. So Austria is a wonderful place to experience music, especially classical music, of course, deep traditions and very famous classical composers who dominate, and a long-standing support from the public for preservation and public access to both classical and contemporary music. Wonderful setting to appreciate that. But along with that, there's also quite a deep tradition of the technical aspects of audio engineering and sound recording. There's great Austrian acoustic companies that are still important today. So it was a wonderful place to do both those things. So on the one hand, I was off doing sound engineering and taking music courses and learning how to composition and what the different instruments sound like. But in my day job, I was learning about the heart and how the heart works. And that institute that I was in was focused very much on the small scale, cell scale. And so that became the foundation for what's now become my career. So I continued to study the heart. I came back to Canada. I decided to do a PhD in physiology and get some serious training in the biomedical and mechanistic aspects of how the heart works. Then that was a fairly short time back in Canada. And then in 1990, I moved here to Utah to initially be a postdoc and then eventually a faculty member. And so the heart is of course, naturally a fascinating organ, but it's relevant, I think, because it does tie into our health and our fitness and so many aspects of our daily lives. Nobody is truly unaware of their own heart, and all of us have had illnesses in our family that have affected people's hearts. So it's a great entry point into lots of interesting conversation. From a scientific perspective, of course, it's, as all specialists will tell you, whatever they're studying is the most important organ and the most fascinating thing to know about. And I certainly suffer from that illness. But it's also, one of these central organs to what we do. And because it's tied so much to our physical health, it became sort of a natural complement as I thought more about the heart and generally the cardiovascular system, all its pieces, and then broadly about the musculoskeletal, all the pieces that are sort of tied together through the cardiovascular system. They overlap so much with all kinds of questions about fitness from the casual person recovering, maybe even from a heart attack, who needs to get themselves in some kind of shape, all the way to the elite athlete. And living in a place like Utah, it's easy to get exposure to that complete range. So I've literally, encountered people just trying to get a lifestyle back after serious illness from cardiovascular disease, all the way up to Olympic and Tour de France caliber athlete. This is the beauty of living in a place like Utah, that we really do have the spectrum. And so bringing that experience with the people around me, back to my research and thinking about what these relationships might mean and how we identify maladies, how we track people, how we follow our own health. This just became a natural fascination. So I had a polar heart rate monitor, very soon after they came out, and I continue to play with whatever gadgets I have just to monitor what's going on my bike. And then I try and bring all that into my classrooms. So I'll use data I've recorded on myself while riding my bike as an exercise for my students to analyze and interpret so that they can understand all the various things that come into power generation, mechanical power generation on a bicycle. I've managed to tie all the pieces, I think, together in a way that makes me feel not completely scattered, but with a lot of different aspects to explore, depending on whatever current opportunities I'm fortunate enough to have.
When you moved to Canada to study, was there always this element of the connection between technology and the human heart, or did that connection evolve over time?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So that probably started already when I was in Austria. I was in what's called medical physics department, which can mean lots of different things, but there were people around me, a close friend to this day who was very involved in elite athletes. He himself was an outstanding athlete, and he became a sports scientist studying, both biomechanics and physiology. And it was just always intriguing to talk to him and learn from him. He's worked with a number of different, actually, ski teams in Austria. Of course, Austria ski teams are the most elite athletes in the country generally, probably even more so than the soccer player. And so he was doing, fitness training with the alpine ski team. And so it was fascinating to share his observations about, that the training they were doing, at this extreme level, and then tying that back to the research that he was doing in the lab. We were both in the same lab setting. It was always sort of part of the mix to think about how does this material, these concepts we're studying in textbooks or trying to understand scientific perspective, how do they translate, into the practice, in this case of extreme elite sports? One of the observations that came strongly and got reinforced even more when he switched to actually ski jumping. He became actually a very well-known figure in the world of the science of ski jumping. He's designed ski jumps. The Innsbruck ski jump, which is used in international competition regularly, is his design. And so he figured out a lot of the mechanics of ski jumping. And one of the interesting perspectives he had when he started into this field is he knew enough about computing. He had a physics background. He knew about the computational modeling aspects enough to know that there was potential. That's where he and I overlapped a lot. I've always been involved in computing and using computers to both understand and simulate physiology of disease and health. And so he started thinking about how he might create a model of ski jumping in order to predict certain behavior. It turns out this was during an era when there was a change in the style of ski jumping, and some of the elite jumpers were suddenly crashing more than they had before, in part because of this new style of jumping. He was already working with the team, so they came to him and said, you're the physicist, you figure this out. Like, why are we crashing? I mean, these are fabulous jumpers, world-class jumpers. All of a sudden, out of the blue, they're crashing. So that got him into a deeper analysis of the whole thing. But the key point here is that he went to all his simulation friends like me and said, okay, how accurately can we do these models? We would say things like, 10%, maybe 5%. That's enough. We can design cars or lots of things with that level of error. That's an acceptable level of error. And he said, 5% is the difference between a world champion and someone who has no chance of making it when it comes to that level of sports. And he said, you have to be able to get me down to 1 or 2% to even be vaguely relevant, because it really comes down to 1 or 2%. This kind of made me appreciate just the impact of this uncertainty, this approximate knowledge that we have, and how this plays out at the high end of sports. And that has helped to this day frame, how I think about physiology and the diseases that we study as well, that small changes in underlying conditions that we barely can measure and oftentimes can't even include in our thinking and have profound influences on somebody's health, or at the other extreme, in their athletic performance. And I just recently heard, just randomly, an interview between, turns out, Peter Attia and Lance Armstrong. And Lance Armstrong, of course, in the bicycle world have probably mixed feelings about. We've all heard of him. And so the question was, what do you think all those drugs did for your performance? And he said 10%. And when you and I think about many aspects of our lives, what's 10%? I mean, a 10% increase in salary, sure, we notice that, but it's not life-changing. But 10% longer on our commute time, these are not big numbers, in our daily lives. But 10% at that point, that end of the spectrum, literally meant the difference between surviving as a professional athlete and not even being on the team, which of course led to all kinds of problems with drug use in cycling, which legacy we're still living with, not of course proud of. But the point is, from my perspective, that the relatively small changes in our function, our physiology, can make really, really big differences in how we perform. And I would argue in how we feel. And so it allowed me to focus on maybe some of the little things that have helped shape my perspective, both in physiology and arguably psychology and life in general.
Well, it really is an interesting illustration, of human potential. That in some aspects, 2%, 3% can make a difference, and to try to improve the systems to give it that kind of accuracy, that's very interesting. You are deputy director of the Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute, and you're also an associate professor of internal medicine. And I'm thinking that throughout your career, from the time you start forming, your pursuit of computing and health and heart function. I mean, I'm thinking there's just been a dramatic change. There's just been advancements in computing and imaging. And I mean, just the aspect of those early computers that you were modeling, the computing power on those we probably have in our phones, I imagine. So you've seen some incredible advances in medical imaging.
Yeah, the advances in computing broadly and imaging and everything that derives from the power that we have in computing. Certainly, it's been a central part of my. When I was in high school, I was one of those nerds who would sneak into a room that we had in our high school that had a paper teletype terminal, and you could sort of type a few commands, and it would go off to some computer somewhere and give you some feedback. And when my first job as undergrad student in research was, we had cards, literally those old computer cards that you've probably seen in movies and things. That really was how we programmed computers. So yes, I've followed this along. I mean, I was born the same year as Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and well, of course, not nearly as famous, but I sort of share with them, moving through this computer generation and engaging in it in a different way. I mean, completely different way, but still, benefiting from the progress so that, in the early 80s, I was doing email. And when I came back from Canada or from Austria to Canada in 1985, I mean, most of the faculty in our department had never heard of it. And one of my little side jobs was teaching all the faculty and eventually the other students how to do email because it was totally new. Internet was just getting started. And so we were just sort of, seeing these things emerge. A little historical side note is that the University of Utah was the fourth node on the internet. So we're quite proud of this. And so it's very much part of the culture here locally. But even before I came here, I just kept seeing these improvements of storage, of speed, of visualization, graphic capabilities of computers, and as you say, even phones have just made astounding improvements. And so throughout my career, I've been at times at a point where I'd say I have an idea for what I would like to use the computer to do, but the computers can't do it yet. And this continues on. And I would say it's let up in the sense that we have amazing capacity, which is improving dramatically and has improved dramatically in the last 10 or 15 years. But when we started the Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute, which was in the early 90s, so this was together with a colleague, Chris Johnson, and there's a bicycle connection here I'll come back to, but when he and I started this thing, we were both working in, trying to do computer models of some aspect of the heart and the physiology and behavior of the heart. And we just kept running into obstacles. We would go, I remember, going to the official computer center on our campus and saying, can we use your computer? And they looked at us strangely and said, who are you? Sort of explained. And they said, you want to use our computer? For what is it you want to use it for? And what makes you think that you can do that? You should have access to this very expensive computer back here that we're busy using to keep track of, I don't know, student records or, the finances of the university, whatever they were doing with it. And they basically showed us the door. And so we regrouped a little bit and said, okay, this isn't working. Fortunately, we were just at a period where still quite expensive, but relatively portable computers were emerging. So from some of the major vendors, again, early 90s. So we managed to convince a few companies to give us some computers to play with and a little bit of technical help. And we just started exploring what these computers could do, doing things that I guess others hadn't done with them in our area. And it just kind of went from there. And I would say we recognized reasonably early on that we were not that special in the sense that there were probably other people out there who, if they could get access to computing, could do amazing things. And that the problem was the access. The computers had reached a point where they were powerful enough, even the computer science that you need to run the computers, solve problems, that was at a mature enough stage. But that there was this huge gap between where the computer scientists were and where the scientific practitioners were. In our case, the medical practitioners. And we thought we need to be able to make both sides aware of this opportunity and build bridges between the computer science and the application. And that became the basis of the scientific computing and imaging, or we call it SKI because we're in Utah. The SKI Institute, took off, because of the relationships that we were able to build. We were able to expand because, again, we were trained enough medically and biomedically that we could discuss problems like this with our biomedical counterparts and say, you could use a computer to do this analysis, whatever. So that's what got it started. And then, along came kind of imaging, mature imaging, especially magnetic resonance imaging, which provided us with a window into the structure of the heart, in my case, and the brain, and other research cases that we just didn't have before. The ability to reconstruct in 3 dimensions, soft tissue and all the structure. That became a whole nother, doorway and an opportunity for us that we quickly tried to make use of and continue to make use of. So at every step of the way, and I think we're still doing this today, kind of trying to gauge, what's possible with computers today and how can we turn that technology into something that ultimately helps people. I'm a biomedical engineer. That's professorship is in biomedical engineering, and that's very much at this interface in the technology, biology, and then applications to medicine. And I ask my students, why in the world would you take on this challenging field of study? They almost all say, because I want to help people. I don't necessarily want to be a doctor, although some of them do, but I really want to help people. And I'm kind of a geek, right? I mean, I grew up fiddling with things, being an engineer, but I want to see my engineering directly as possible go toward helping. And that's what our field is. So it's a very resonant space for kind of thinking. And then I guess briefly to close the loop. So the bicycle connection here is that when I first came here, I loved the cycling here is really quite amazing. The weather is perfect for it. And so Chris Johnson and I would, every odd day of the month, there's a canyon here that goes from the city up into the mountains called City Creek Canyon. And every odd day of the month, it's open to cyclists. And so every odd day of the month, we would finish our day, the end of our working day, we would get on our bikes and we would ride up the canyon together. We would talk and scheme, plan, figure out what are we going to do next? What's the next move? What's the next grant opportunity? Who's the next collaborator we could find? How are we going to go forward? And so the whole basis of, the Institute, which is now a couple hundred people and has its own building and all this wonderful stuff, way beyond what we ever thought would be possible. Those were its origins. And I contend that mixture of kind of physical exertion, being outdoors. So once you get into the canyon road, there's no traffic, bikes and pedestrians, and you're going uphill. So it's quite calm. You're exerting yourself, but we would do it at a pace we could still talk. And there was just that setting and those conditions, both in our bodies and around us, is just the perfect place to let your mind run, explore ideas, speculate on what we might do. It really did form the basis, not only for a great friendship, but also for the ideas that we were able to convert into practice.
That's such a great story. I go out, for 2-hour rides frequently. I never listen to anything, and there's several elements to it. One is just, it gives me the space. I don't have to do anything else. It's not easy for me to respond to text messages or anything while I'm writing. And so there's just this space to just think. And then I do believe there's blood moving, there's oxygen moving. I think there's probably an element of brain function. And then there's an element of rhythm. And I've talked before on the podcast, it seems to me like there's almost this physiological meditation, body movement kind of element to being in a rhythm on a bike when you get on a long flat and you're just keeping the 90 revolutions per minute or whatever. It just seems like it creates a unique space to really contemplate things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the really fun part, again, this is me geeking out as a scientist, but we have those perceptions which we share and they're very real, but now we know the neuroscience behind a great deal of, because there's compelling evidence of the benefits of physical exercise for our mental health, for our psychological well-being, and exactly these sort of zones we get in, this sort of meditative almost aspects that allows us to think freely, allows ideas to percolate up. These are now, the topic of studies and this again is where imaging comes in. There are imaging modalities that can give us at least indirect insights into which part of our brains are active during certain exercises or certain activities generally. And they suggest that indeed important parts of our brain are activated during exercise like this, exercise that is not something we need to focus on. So this is the beauty, as you say, the rhythm of it. You get into rhythm, you get into a groove, don't have to pay too much attention, assuming there's not too much traffic. Same is true with running and swimming, these sort of aerobic sports where there's a natural rhythm involved that are very different from playing tennis or alpine skiing. Really have to focus, or mountain biking. That's a very different type of brain activity that's going on in those two different scenarios. And there's something intrinsically beneficial on top of that, which is also being documented, just being outdoors. There's many studies on trying to understand what is it about being outdoors that just makes most people feel better. Like just going for a walk, just being outdoors. There's something that happens in our brain in that sort of space. Now, again, there's lots of studies to show or try and explore whether it's just the visual or is it the sound, is it the smells of the outdoor? Like, what is it that stimulates our brain in this way, which is, fascinating. But practically speaking, the takeaway is just go do it because you'll feel better. And cycling, fits so well into that paradigm. I think it combines all of those aspects of, as you say, the blood flow, the circulation, the disconnection with the daily, requirements, which we have to get to at some point in our lives, but we decouple from all those external stressors, and then we build a physiological base and a neurophysiological base that really allows us to recover, to have thoughts that build our happiness. That, I don't know if you hear this, is sort of famous in my t-shirts. So, life is an integral of happiness over time. And so, the more we can improve and do things to improve our happiness, and that's a whole field of study by itself, the more we can do that, I think the just more content and happy and productive and all those things that we feel with our lives. And cycling and sports like it are just, perfect for that.
This season of the podcast, I've really moved into a realm where I'm talking about the bike as a medical device,
Yeah.
and some people feel uncomfortable with that because it's like, well, a medical device, isn't there some kind of approval for a medical device? And I think that's a fair thing to question. But if you think of exercise as medicine, if we're going to embrace that concept, then I think the bicycle is as good of a medical device as anything you can find. And I'm thinking from what you're saying is that imaging and analysis is really verifying that exercise is medicine.
Exactly. I mean, I think especially these functional MRI studies have really given us important clues, because we know in sometimes remarkably detailed terms what different parts of the brain are, more or less respond. I mean, I was going to say there's a lot of generic knowledge, but it turns out that there's some difference between individuals, of course, but there's enough generic knowledge that certain parts of our brain are responsible for certain action. And if we can identify which parts of the brain are active under which behaviors, then we can start to tie those behaviors and the responses to different types of brain activity. And that's generically provided us with this insight into, why it is that these things have why they feel good, why we as sort of amateurs just experience a feeling of calm, feeling of inspiration, or we have insights, we have ideas. I mean, some of my best, but I would argue some of my worst ideas have probably come to me when I'm out riding my bike. And you're in that space where ideas percolate. There's more and more evidence that, again, imaging especially has allowed us to connect to neurological functions and neurophysiological mechanisms. And then when you tie that into what we know about the brain and the brain has evolved and the various aspects of the brain, primitive limbic brain, the more cognitive brain, the various perceptive aspects of the brain, where do we think about words? Where do we put logical ideas together, where our language centers, and there's we're tying all this together in wonderful ways that continue to point to exercise as probably one of the most fundamental steps to general health, not just physical health, but literally to mental health, happiness, results of improvement in symptoms of depression and anxiety and all these horrible disorders that are really affecting especially our young people. And this is where it comes together for me. Positive benefits of exercise there are just getting more and more compelling all the time. It is the best medication. Very many comparisons made. If you sort of list all the benefits of exercise, and then you compare that with the benefits of any medication you can think of, even the ones that we agree are more or less benign that really help us deal with pain or whatever. If you had a drug that did 10% of what exercise would be, you'd have a blockbuster drug. And so it's very clear that the benefits are enormous. The trick now, and while that exploration goes on, it's incredibly important. The trick now, of course, is how do we get people to bring exercise into their lives? Because lots of us know what we should be doing and have a very hard time executing. And so now we're into this place where how do we attract people to, whatever sport it is? In our case, our shared love of cycling. How do we get people into cycling? How do we make it easy for them to get into the sport in a comfortable way, where they feel supported, where they don't feel revealed, where they don't feel they have to get competitive, where they just have mechanical support, where they're not abandoned somewhere by the side of the road with a flat tire and no knowledge of how to fix it. There are so many things we as cyclists, I think, are doing and should be doing to enhance at least, some part of the population to spend some of their time doing, what is arguably one of the best life sports that I can imagine. I mean, running tends to be one of those sports that has a limited lifespan. Most people, when they get to a certain age, joint problems, whatever, it makes it very difficult to run. Hiking works pretty well for lots of people, but hiking in nice areas can be a little hard to get to. I mean, we're spoiled here in a place like Utah, but it can be a hard one. Cycling fits everywhere. You can cycle in New York City. It is one of those great sports that can provide a life of physical activity. And I think our job, maybe mine as a scientist, is to continue to explore the benefits, but I think our collective as a community, as a bicycle community, I think our role should be, and we're doing an amazing job in that area, our job should be to make cycling attractive, feasible, doable, by explaining it, by, encouraging people the right way, guiding them gently. Maybe it's time to get a pair of bike shorts. Maybe it's time to think about a little improvement in your bicycle. It's gentle things like that, but at the same time, just basically saying, welcome to an amazing sport. And we want you to be part of our supportive, wonderful community.
I have this kind of intersection. I have a master's of public health and health promotion and education. I have a master's in marriage and family therapy. And so, which is kind of, really a systems degree. So it's this kind of combination about, kind of healthy behavior systems, and it had all this knowledge, and yet year after year after year, I kept saying, man, I got to do something here. This is the year that I got to do something. It took pictures, literal pictures, but a picture of my function, my metabolic function. That I'm like, okay, if I don't do something about this now, I'm going to lose the opportunity to really impact this. And I'm glad I did. For me, being able to look at a heart as much as we can, through imaging or functional capacity measurements, whatever, and say, look, here's the difference between a healthy heart, someone who stayed active, or someone who got active, and the heart of someone who's 75 who never got active. That's incredibly valuable. At the same time, I think what you're talking about is there is a societal element, and I'm really interested in how we can build a community that has some things that are built into it that are countercultural, because the cultural element just frankly is a sedentary element. And so, combining like some cultural elements with some real good data about, what a difference it can make, I, I think in there has to be both those components to actually make real change.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And what you would know as a public health expert, that there's lots of things that we know would be good for society and good for our population, yet are incredibly difficult to get into common, regular implementation. This is this is one of the aspects of studying the heart that's so compelling, that while we work on different details of the heart and how it works and how to fix it and how to understand the illnesses, it turns out that to make a massive improvement in cardiovascular health, we don't need to do any more research. We know enough now to change, for enormous percentages of the population. While that might undermine my future career, I don't care, because this is really, I'd love to see society do better. And so I think we're forced now to think about things just as you're describing, of how do we combine the information, which is important. People want to know why they're doing something, and just telling them, do it, it's good for you, trust me, it is no longer enough, at least among any discerning person who thinks about anything at all. So there has to be some information to compel or to motivate them to think about. Unfortunately, that's not enough to change lifestyle and behavior. So we need to combine that with opportunities that sort of tap into what individual sensations are about what's enjoyable. We have to find a way to make exercise an enjoyable thing and a beneficial thing. And so that's where we have to explore, like, what role does exercise play for each individual, and how can we sort of just encourage them to explore it? And that's so varied. And you've seen with your group rides and the sort of bike club activities, that companionship, that being in a group, can be an amazingly supportive, really can bring people out on the weekend, even when it's raining, because I got to go because the group's waiting for me, and I've told people I'm going to be there for the ride, and they've gone to all this trouble to organize the food stations, so I have to participate. I learned about this. I've organized century rides, for a number of years, my early years here, so I've seen how that plays out and how incredibly motivating that can be. And that's one view of it. And then another view, which I have to say is the one I live more now, and so I can convince people maybe more authentically, is to say, yeah, but just go out on your own, just like you're explaining. Just go out on your own and ride your bike for, and just not you don't have to go far, you don't have to go fast. Just find a nice place. Just go out and do it for a little bit, and then see how you feel. Like, reflect a little bit afterwards and say, how was that? And you might say, yeah, my knees a little sore, or my back's a little sore, but I feel good. And this plays out, in our home. My wife is sometimes a little hard to get motivated some mornings to go for a ride, but I sort of I convince her, and I've done everything I can to make cycling work for her. And she grumbles a little bit and she moans about having to go, but then every time we do it, we come back and thank you so much for motivating me to go out and do this. And I think that through this range of approaches and some sensitivity to individual needs and pleasures, we can find ways to get people to ultimately be in that place where they're doing the right thing, good about what they're doing, and and enjoy the health benefits and all the other psychological benefits that come with it. It's going to need this sort of empathetic, appropriate, gentle, coaxing, guiding, supporting combination to make it work. And it's what I do with my students. I mean, the last thing I say, especially on Friday classes, is whatever you do, get outside for some exercise this week. Like, I don't care. If you're late for your homework, let me know. But I want to know that as many of you as possible are out there doing stuff, and they know. They can't help but know that I ride my bike, that I'm active. I'm very open and vulnerable with them about it, and don't try never to say it out of any feelings of pride or of ego, but just simply to say, please, give it a try. And if I see them, this is the lovely part. I encounter them on my rides. I bump into my students, and it's a great moment. See them out there. Love to acknowledge them, talk to them, find out how their day's going, what their cycling story is. And I hope in that small way to be, living, yes, what I think really is beneficial, being authentic and consistent in a way that maybe, could motivate a few of them to give it a try.
Well, that's fantastic, and you're bringing up all kinds of stuff that I could just run with. Yeah, we could talk about this for an hour, you know, but I want to get back to some of this. I can you talk about the Delphi Data Science Initiative? What is the aim of that initiative?
Sure, sure. It's a natural consequence of what I described before, of this ongoing effort that I've been lucky enough to be involved in, of exploring where computing is from a technical perspective, and then trying to see where we could connect it to other areas of science. And so Delphi is a medical initiative. It includes membership from across our School of Medicine and health sciences generally here at the University of Utah. And it really reflects a goal to employ the contemporary, what we call data science technique. So data science is not a new form of science. Performing a statistical analysis of some measurements is arguably a data science method, but as time has evolved and we've gotten more sophisticated in how we can, explore these data sets, and we've gotten bigger data sets that, of course, reveal more information. The computing tools have allowed us to analyze data in completely new ways, and it's a fundamentally different approach to science than we've had in the past, which has often been driven by this idea that we have an underlying notion of how A influences B. We enter a warm room and our perspiration rate goes up because our body's trying to cool it. Very direct. And we even represent that as a mathematical set of equations sometimes. Write down, sometimes very straightforward math and explain a behavior. Data science does not take that approach. It just says there's patterns in those data sets that we yet, even with our sophisticated brains, really can't see the patterns in without some help. And the data science techniques are the ways that give us insight into these patterns, connections. See, and sometimes those connections just lead to sort of what I would say they relate phenomena. When you look statistically and you look at somebody's age and their weight, you might see a connection. Start to assume there's some mechanistic relationship, age and weight. But as you get deeper into the data science and get richer and richer data sets, then you can get into the more subtle questions, and oftentimes the more meaningful questions of, it's not just age. It's age combined with their medical state, combined with their lifestyle, combined with their eating habits. There's a whole bunch of factors that drive that output of, let's say, weight or longevity or whatever our output number is. So Delphi was created to try and leverage those computer techniques in the data science space in a broad range of application. And so for me, it was another fabulous opportunity to listen to clinical colleagues say, I have this data set. I've been collecting these data. I just thought, I don't know, this is the stuff I can get from my patients easily, and we can anonymize it and protect their privacy and do all those sorts of things. But now I need somebody to help me analyze it. And so then I have a number of connections with more technical computer scientists, mathematicians, physicists, who may not understand much about medicine, but they have some really fun techniques that they're dying to try out on a good data set. And so the general approach here is, can we build a bridge between those groups on particular projects? That very much fits into the ethos of what we've always been about at the Ski Institute. And I would argue that ethos is, percolated out across the campus. This is a very intellectually open community, and there are very few boundaries between, institutes, departments, whatever on the campus. It's never been a problem for a physician to wander down to the math department and say, I need some help, explaining something that might be mathematically interesting. So Delphi is really, seeking to do that. So it has a very broad range of applications and has led to some really interesting projects, metrics that we in science worry about, like papers published and support we can get to continue that research. So Delphi's been, yeah, I say it's been it felt like a natural progression for me to go from some of the physics-based or the mathematically based approaches I've pursued in the early parts of my career now into these data science approaches. Now, of course, data science in the modern vernacular is kind of code for artificial intelligence. A lot of these techniques we're talking about are, come out of that long-standing effort to improve our understanding of data through methods like machine learning and there's a lot of underlying technologies that sit underneath AI and what we see as AI and what gets the headlines as AI is really just one small part of it. That it's an important part for sure, but there's a lot more technology underneath the hood that we can apply in a range of settings and really make novel breakthroughs that we couldn't otherwise do, where the complexity of the data available is so large that there's no simple equation that's going to link all these together. We need to take a different view, and the data-driven view is a really fascinating one, and it is the contemporary approach that we're trying to chase.
It's so interesting because there's so many components to it. There's the end where someone is polling, they're measuring something that's going on physically, measuring something with the heart that's going on. And then, in creating those data sets, just a lot of different individual numbers that are being measured. And then there's like you're talking about the scientists who are developing ways of using the computer to analyze things and the analytic expertise that it takes to do that. And then there's the hardware and having the chipsets that are able to move at a speed and in addition to be cooled and all the things that have to happen in order to have that massive computational power. So what a unique time to live in, to seeing some of those things being stretched to the limits, which sounds similar to when you were saying, boy, we could, way back when you're saying, hey, can we use your computer at the university? Because this is starting to get more complex. And now you're at a totally different place, but that same thing of seeing the boundaries being stretched from what we have available.
Yeah, yeah, and the good news is that here on the university campus, things have also evolved in a good direction where now in the world of computing we have administrative computing and we have academic computing, and the administrative computing, it's important, track of emails and all that good stuff. Then we have a scientific computing, and things have evolved now on that front that the hardware, the people who maintain the systems, work in parallel with us. So they're also under the same director as they're kind of a parallel organization with us at the Ski Institute. So, so now we bring those two worlds even closer together so that we understand where the new developments are and the limitations are in hardware, try and figure out how to make software that leverages strength.
Kind of looking at a specific example, and this might not work. I'm hoping this works, but a long time ago got introduced to the Carbonin formula. Are you familiar with the Carbonin formula? Okay, so
no, I don't know.
It is, you've probably heard of it, you just don't even heard of it. It's the 220 minus age.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that was someone looking at data and analyzing data and saying, okay, I think this is a way for us to estimate max heart rate. That formula just, I believe, has no relevance for me at all.
Right.
If I take 220 minus age, I wouldn't be able to, basically bike down the street if I was going to stay below that heart rate. And so, and I don't know, I don't have a good way right now of knowing what my max heart rate is. I don't want to go to failure, and say, okay, now I know because my heart failed. It's that really rough formula from, decades ago that now things have changed so much as far as how could look at an individual person and say this is a good training heart rate for you. I don't does that bring up thoughts for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at one point in my career, I was very involved in the bike racing community here as well. I was the president of a local bike racing club, and we would go out on training rides, and we'd be, a mix of generally fairly fit people. There was certainly the racing team; they were the elite, and then there was the rest of us, and most of the people in the group would do a little bit of racing, various forms, either time trials or criterion. And I remember going on a ride up a canyon near here. I mean, this what makes riding so great here is we have city is it's on a high plateau. It's relatively high. It's 4,500 feet, but it's more or less flat. And then the mountains just start right behind the city. So we ride up the canyon. This is some of the most pleasurable and the coolest in the hot days of summer. So we were doing one of our regular rides up the canyon. So Rob, the physiologist, was riding up to different people as we're riding up the canyon, saying, "What's your heart rate? What's your heart rate?" But because we're all kind of going at the same pace. We're all as a group together. There's a reasonable variability in age. I was probably around 40 or so in my 40s by that stage, and we had certainly people in their 20s. And I don't think we had many people older than that. But but we were all generating the same power output roughly. And the range of numbers, people would just look down at their heart rates or look at their watches and say, "Oh yeah, I'm at 130, and this person will be 110, and this person will be cooking along 160." And I realized then, okay, this is the reality of physiology. This is the differences naturally, natural variability that exists in us as humans. And it really opened my eyes to, what we're talking about. Because like you, I never found that formula was very informative. Really interesting part about our lives today is we have better measurement technology. So we can track our heart rate as long as we're active, but that also we can use various other input data points like the power we generate, right? I have a set of pedals on my bike that measures the power, and that provides some input. And this is where the overlap with the data science happens. So there are better and better models that tap into more variables across a wider range of populations, which paradoxically allow us to more individualize the analysis of our personal data. So we can feed our data into one of these models. And this is what's happening in the world of mostly performance sports. It will trickle down to us. And we see a little bit when you input your data into Strava or some other application like it's going into a model. And it's, if I ride and don't necessarily have my power meter or my power pedals, it will still come up with an estimate of the power I'm generating. And those models are getting more and more sophisticated, and they're using these AI tools. So not large language models, but the other aspect of AI, which is machine learning and, allowing models to predict individual behavior based on a deep well of data. And so we're going to see better and better predictions of our performance and analyze this, especially if we follow this over time and see how things are evolving. At our age, you always often wonder, how much longer can I keep this up? What can I expect of the inevitability of age affecting my performance? And, what are the real boundaries and what are the boundaries that are in our heads? Because society has told us, oh, you're over 60, you're going to go downhill at some prescribed rate, and you almost feel obliged to follow that decline. And we're learning that a lot of that is just not correct. So I think, in ways that we may not even notice, because again, the software is going to percolate up into these applications that some of us use to track our data. We're going to see more and more accurate prediction. So now, as another example, so when I finish a ride on Strava and I upload the data, I get a little summary that tells me what kind of workout I have. You've probably seen the same thing. And it notices, oh, you spent you did some good 3-minute power intervals there. That's, it's better than last week. So this is where the data revolution is going to, one of many ways, it's going to play out in so much of what we do, and definitely is going to affect or give us data that we can use to make some of our health decisions, and some of our training decisions, some of our nutrition decisions, or started playing with an application. I was just a little curious, what's my protein output like? The big topic, of course, now.
Right.
How much protein do we need? And especially as we age and as we exercise. So I'm playing with one of these apps and just, to see what it will tell me. And I'm sure it will have inside some AI type methods that I hope will give me some insights. How what my overall nutritional status is.
Do you have a sense of how general practitioners are thinking? Do you think that they are well aware of kind of all the tools that are available? The data analysis. Um, is that working its way into the curriculum, or do you think there's a long way to go with that?
Yeah, it's definitely coming into the curriculum. In fact, generically, the use of computers I've seen come into the curriculum at our university over the course of the last 20 years. It was a time when a medical library was just full of journals, textbooks. And now our medical library has a whole floor dedicated to computers and simulation and various things that expose the medical professionals, not just medical students, but PAs and nurses and whoever's getting trained, to the use of computers in their practice. So we're definitely seeing more and more of that over the past couple of decades. Of course, the current revolution almost is coming with the advent of machine learning and AI techniques. And this is where there's some huge, I would say, very optimistic signs that there are new methods, data science-driven methods that really can help with the management of patients, but that they are largely living in the research. We had a wonderful presentation by a very, very well-known, he's actually a cardiologist by training, but much better known as kind of a doctor, very broadly imaginative and wonderfully grounded doctor in this space. His name is Eric Topol. He's had a long career. He's also about my age and came to visit last fall. He had a wonderful presentation he did, and we had some great chats. And he has written a book on AI in medicine some time ago, which was actually turns out to be quite prescient. He gave a wonderful presentation and showed example after example of where AI could change medical practice. In each case, backed up with scientific publications, studies that illustrated the benefits, improvements over unassisted guidance or unassisted decision making, and quite convincing. And at the end of the presentation, he said, "Yeah, but none of these have actually been tried. None of them are incorporated yet into practice." And that's the stage we're at. We have all these tools that show fabulous potential, but now we've got to get into this hard work of trying them in clinical practices, initially in academic medical centers, probably, because that's the way it often goes. And then we're going to see how they percolate out into the community. And you get, very famous advanced clinics like the Mayo Clinic. They have this is a system I know a little bit about, that they have a dashboard for analyzing ECGs using some very sophisticated machine learning approaches to try and improve diagnostics of their patients. ECG is a wonderful target because it's a very cheap, painless, non-invasive measurement to make. So it's very tempting to try and extract all that we possibly can from it. It is shown, indeed, that there's lots of information that we never thought would be embedded in this signal. Cardiologists would have said, "Yeah, we figured that out, 100 years ago. We had the ECG. We figured it out 40 years ago, maybe. We have our algorithms. They tell us certain things, but there's just hard limits to what the ECG can do for us." Those limits are now changing, and very surprising features. Like, it's with very good accuracy, it's possible to tell the sex of a subject from their ECG, something that nobody thought would be real. Nobody ever even guessed that information was somehow embedded in an ECG signal, but it appears to be. There's lots of other arguably more medically relevant details that are in an ECG. The Mayo Clinic has, put together a system. They claim it's part of their daily practice. And that will only be a matter of time before that does make its way out. And they're, of course, studying carefully the impact of the system. How does it improve patient care? How does it improve outcomes? All those important things. So we're in that stage where proof of concepts are there across almost all of medicine. And now we're at this stage of sort of this hard work of adapting it to practical utility. And I'll close by saying, the one piece of technology that does seem to have penetrated very quickly into medical practice, it's very simple in concept. It's a little device that records the audio of the patient-doctor interview and extracts the relevant information from that interview and stores that in the patient's electronic record. So the doctor, instead of sitting at a computer taking notes and obviously being distracted, I mean, you cannot possibly operate a computer and pay attention to, I would argue, anything, and certainly not a patient, at the same time. I mean, multitasking is highly overrated in many people's minds. Lots of evidence to support that too. So the idea that you could just let this device keep track of things and really focus on the patient and really use the highly evolved medical intuition that good diagnosticians, practitioners develop over time is an incredible opportunity, I think, to improve medical care. If we could have this sense when we're talking to our primary care physicians, at least, that they're actually listening to us, they're watching our faces, they're getting our body language, they're picking up on the subtleties because they don't have to worry about taking notes. And because, of course, there has to be a record of, makes sense, there has to be a record of this appointment, and they're under all kinds of time pressure, blah, blah, blah. So the challenge that Topol posed in this talk, and I've heard other people describe, is what will the medical profession and the healthcare industry and the insurance companies drive a lot of it? What will they do with that extra time that a physician in principle will have because they don't have to take notes? And he, of course, as a dedicated clinician, says we should protect that time. We should protect and use that extra time to really engage with our patients and to add value to what we as physicians have developed as a skill set that no machine has so far. And we all have our areas of expertise where I would argue we have an intuition of a situation that isn't something you can write down. It doesn't fit into a textbook. It's just a certain sense of, for this situation, this is the way to respond. This is the solution. This is the approach we're going to use to fix this problem. And if physicians can get the opportunity to focus on that skill set, they will be more effective as physicians. And maybe just as importantly, they will feel more satisfied in their profession. They will feel like I'm not being replaced by a machine anytime soon. There's not going to be an AI that takes over my medical practice. I can actually focus on what I've trained for and what I've developed great intuition for and be ultimately more effective at looking after. So this little bit of technology, this ability to transcribe a conversation, it has the potential to be transformed. If the medical industry complex, whatever you want to see it as, if they're allowed, to operate in a way that places the patients first, not bottom line and profit.
It is an elevated view of the opportunity of having more time, and that sounds wonderful. I hope that elevated view can win out. So.
Yeah, I have clinical colleagues who are completely skeptical, who say, no, we're going to have to see twice as many patients. Right. That's what's going to happen.
Right.
And so, but I think it's a little bit emblematic of what it is that we will see these tools accomplish, or at least enable, if we handle it right. So, in my world as a professor, I can use AI tools in ways that can save time in preparing my classes, doing some of the mundane tasks, some of the routine things. And if that saves time for me to actually spend more time with my students and listen to them more carefully and work with them more closely, I see that as beneficial and incredibly gratifying. I did not become a professor to spend all of my time on paperwork or all the background tasks. And it'll be up to every profession to evaluate where these things can help them and what to do with the space it creates.
Well, let's end up this way. Do you have any cycling adventures coming up?
Yeah, we were just talking about this on the weekend. So not a lot directly in sight, but just to give you a sense of what often happens. I travel a great deal. This is part of the life of many academics, to go to research meetings and collaborate with other people, and often in other countries. And so around 1995, I purchased my first folding bicycle. from a company called Green Gear, it was called then, now Bike Friday. So it fits in a suitcase and I travel with it whenever I'm going anywhere for any amount of time. Sometimes a harmless, let's say, quasi-harmless conference can turn into a bicycle adventure quite spontaneously. So that inevitably happens. And I've had some fabulous opportunities I've ridden there's a pass in the Pyrenees that was actually the very, very first mountain pass ever used in the Tour de France, called the Tourmalet. And I was traveling between Spain and France, for two related, very professional activities. But I got to carve out a couple of days in between and could unpack my little folding bike and ride up the Tourmalet. And so we have a lot of ventures that sort of happen that way. What we also have taken to doing is traveling to a place where there is a lot of good cycling, finding a home base, and rather than bike touring from A to B with or without support, we will settle in ideally a small village somewhere remote. This year we were in part of the Provence, or the northern part of the Provence, and we rented a little Airbnb, and I had my folding bike, and my wife rented an e-bike from a village nearby, which is of course easier and easier to do these days. And so every day we would wake up and get rolling at some point mid-morning, and then we'd ride for a few hours and end up at some beautiful little medieval village on some other part of the valley, and get there just in time, just randomly in time for a nice lunch. And then we would enjoy a nice lunch, explore the village, and then make our way home again. So a lot of the adventures end up, being those kind of trips. And then every once in a while, like I say, this year, the other big adventure, something I've always wanted to at least see and explore, is the again, famous at the Tour de France, climb up the Alpe d'Huez. And so I did a little bit of research and just, I knew about this little village at the base. And so we rented a place there. And I did indeed get to ride my bike up the Alpe d'Huez this year. So that's sort of the flavor that our adventures often take. Just finding a nice spot and not feeling compelled on any given day to do any particular ride. And we love that unstructured approach. We're so dialed in now that it just runs, sort of by itself. We know what we have to take. We know what we have to do. We know how to do the research to find the rental bikes. And so that's become our ongoing flavor. And I think, there'll be lots of that in the future. We just haven't decided yet which opportunities to attach to my professional life that we're going to take advantage of.
I love it. That just sounds delightful for sure. Well, Dr. MacLeod, thank you so much. I'm glad you reached out and introduced yourself, and we got to have a bit of an email exchange. And I'm just really appreciative of you coming on and giving a view of something that, I just don't see. I don't think a lot of people really see kind of what behind the scene as far as these things that are happening to improve the way that we can measure what's going on physiologically with us, that enable us to, like you talked about, a paradox, but enable us to look more individually by being able to gather more data across many realms. So thanks for coming on and bringing your expertise to the podcast.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. I really applaud what you're doing with the podcast. I think you're playing an incredibly motivating role for those of us on the latter side of 60, encouraging us to stay active. And I wish you good luck going forward.
Well, thank you. And maybe we'll talk again sometime.
Sounds great.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
We hear all the time that AI is going to transform every industry. I don't think that's hyperbolic. In my opinion, we need to embrace what AI can provide in the area of the pursuit of longevity. Obviously, AI is far from perfect, but my experience is that there are some interesting outputs that can come from AI with its ability to analyze data. We certainly live in an interesting time. Not only are we seeing the rise of AI, but also we have access to more and more technology that is providing individual data. Rob mentioned power pedals. I really appreciate being given a set of power pedals a few months back. As I look at being able to compete in cyclocross, I have two sets of data that are extremely helpful. My goal is to be able to generate over 200 watts for 45 minutes while keeping my heart rate under 160 beats per minute. If I can do this, I think I will be happy with my performance during a cyclocross race. And it also gives me a base to try to grow from. On August 17th, 2023, I did an episode that was an interaction with AI. I think I'll do something similar and have a conversation with AI about a training program for doing better with cyclocross next year. Stay tuned for more information on that. I hope that as the weather gets worse here in North America, that you are finding some great fall riding. I also hope that you have what you need to enjoy getting out in less than ideal weather. And remember, age is just a gear change.